Once he's dead, he's taken off the cross and wrapped in cloth and taken to a borrowed tomb.
And because of the contact with the body of Jesus, that transforms and leaves a lasting mark on the cloth.
For centuries, the Shroud of Turin has been one of the most controversial objects in human history. To millions of believers, it is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. To skeptics, it is a medieval artifact whose mysterious image somehow fooled generations of people. But then scientists began looking at something far smaller than the image itself. Not the face, not the bloodstains, not even the strange way the image appears on the fabric. They looked at what was trapped between the microscopic fibers: dust, pollen, human biological material, and fragments of DNA. What they found appeared to tell a story far more complicated than anyone expected. Because if the genetic traces really came from centuries of contact with the cloth, then the shroud was carrying something like a biological travel diary, an invisible record of the people, places, and cultures it had encountered during its mysterious journey. And that raised a question that still refuses to disappear. How could one piece of ancient linen carry genetic signatures associated with regions as distant as the Middle East, Europe, Africa, and Asia? To understand why that discovery became so controversial, we have to go back to the moment when the shroud first revealed that its image was unlike anything people had seen before. It was May 28, 1898, in Turin, Italy. An amateur photographer named Secondo Pia had been given permission to photograph the relic during a public exhibition. Photography at the time was nothing like it is today. There were no digital cameras, no instant previews, and no way to simply take another picture with a phone. Pia worked with large glass photographic plates. After carefully photographing the shroud, he returned to his darkroom. Late that night, he developed one of the plates. And then something extraordinary appeared. Instead of the distorted image expected from the cloth, the photographic negative revealed a remarkably detailed human face. Deep-set eyes, a beard, a damaged-looking nose. Features that were difficult to see clearly on the original linen suddenly appeared with astonishing contrast. Pia later described the experience as deeply unsettling. The shroud itself already contained an image, but when photographed, that image behaved like a photographic negative. The discovery transformed the debate. If the shroud were simply painted, how had someone centuries before the invention of photography created an image whose light and dark patterns produced such a striking negative? That question became one of the central mysteries surrounding the cloth. But the photograph was only the beginning. More than a century later, scientists began approaching the shroud from a completely different direction. Instead of asking what the image represented, they asked something much more measurable. What was actually trapped inside the fabric? The answer was microscopic and potentially much more revealing. Researchers examining ancient textiles know that fabric can act like a biological archive. Tiny particles can become trapped between threads and remain there for extremely long periods of time. Skin cells, hair, dust, pollen, microorganisms, and, under the right conditions, fragments of genetic material. The shroud had been handled, displayed, folded, transported, repaired, touched, kissed, and examined by countless people over the centuries. If biological traces had accumulated on it, then the cloth might contain a record of its own journey. Researchers, therefore, became interested in mitochondrial DNA. Unlike nuclear DNA, mitochondrial DNA exists in many copies inside cells and is passed through the maternal line. That makes it particularly useful when researchers are working with degraded biological material. The goal was not to discover some magical genetic signature belonging to Jesus. Science cannot identify a person from a mysterious ancient cloth simply by finding random DNA. The real question was much more interesting. Could the genetic material reveal where the shroud had traveled? When genetic sequences recovered from ancient material are compared with population databases, researchers can sometimes identify broad ancestral or geographic patterns. And according to the source material behind this investigation, The results were unexpectedly diverse. Some sequences appeared consistent with populations from the Middle East. Others were associated with European lineages. Additional traces appeared connected with parts of Africa and South Asia. That did not automatically prove that the shroud was authentic. In fact, there was an obvious alternative explanation: contamination. The shroud had been exposed to humans for hundreds of years. Medieval Europeans had handled it. Modern researchers had touched it. Pilgrims had gathered around it. So finding European DNA on the cloth would hardly be surprising. The real question was whether the broader genetic distribution could be explained by the shroud's documented history. And this is where the story becomes fascinating. Imagine a piece of fabric traveling through the ancient world, not sealed inside a sterile laboratory, not protected inside a modern museum case, but displayed before crowds of people, carried across cities, touched by pilgrims, handled by religious authorities, exposed to dust, clothing, skin, hair, and the environment. Every contact could leave behind microscopic biological evidence. If the shroud really had traveled through the Middle East before eventually appearing in Europe, then its DNA would not necessarily belong to one person. It could represent thousands of encounters, a biological fingerprint of history itself. One proposed route becomes especially important here. The ancient city of Edessa, in modern-day Turkey, appears in traditions surrounding a mysterious image associated with Christ. According to historical accounts discussed in the source material, an image connected with Jesus was preserved in Edessa and later transferred to Constantinople. Edessa was not an isolated location. It sat near major trade routes connecting different civilizations. Merchants moved between the Mediterranean, Persia, Central Asia, India, and regions farther east. People traveled, goods traveled, religious ideas traveled, and biological traces traveled with them. A cloth displayed in such an environment could accumulate evidence from people originating from remarkably different parts of the world. This would provide a possible explanation for why genetic material found on the shroud appears geographically diverse. But there was another clue that researchers believed could tell an even more specific story. Pollen. Unlike DNA, pollen can sometimes be linked directly to particular plants and geographic regions. And according to investigations described in the source material, researchers identified numerous pollen types associated with regions of the Middle East, Turkey, and Europe. Some were particularly interesting because the plants they came from grow in restricted geographic areas. One plant repeatedly mentioned in the shroud debate is Gundelia tournefortii, a thorny plant found in the region around Jerusalem. Its significance comes from more than geography. The plant has long, rigid spines. That immediately raises an unsettling possibility. Could such a plant have been used to create a crown of thorns? The idea cannot by itself prove anything. But the concentration of pollen around parts of the shroud associated with the head has fueled speculation for decades. And this is where the mystery becomes difficult to separate from the history surrounding it. Because if the pollen really originated from plants growing around Jerusalem, then the shroud had somehow come into contact with that environment. The obvious response is contamination. A cloth does not need to be the burial shroud of Jesus to pick up Middle Eastern pollen. It only needs to spend time there. And that distinction is crucial. The evidence can tell us where biological material may have come from. It cannot automatically tell us exactly when it arrived. That is the problem researchers face with almost every ancient object. A 1,000-year-old artifact can contain material from several different periods. The object may be ancient. The contamination may be recent. Or the contamination itself may be centuries old. The shroud presents an especially difficult case because of its extraordinary history of handling. And then there is the most controversial evidence of all, the blood. For decades, researchers have debated whether the reddish stains on the shroud represent genuine blood or artistic pigment. Some tests have suggested the presence of blood-related material, while other interpretations remain heavily disputed. The source material describes analyses that identified biological markers associated with severe trauma. If accurate, Those findings would be significant because the markings on the shroud appear consistent with a person who suffered extensive physical injury. There are markings across the back that have been interpreted as evidence of scourging. There are wounds around the wrists and feet. There is an apparent injury to the side of the body, and the blood flows appear to have physical characteristics that researchers have tried to reconstruct. But perhaps the most disturbing detail is the pattern of the scourging. The marks have often been compared with the Roman flagrum, a type of whip capable of causing deep tissue damage. That would fit the historical description of Roman crucifixion. Yet again, there is a problem. A forensic resemblance is not the same thing as proof of identity. The shroud may preserve evidence of a brutally injured man, but science cannot simply leap from that fact to the conclusion that the man was Jesus. And that is exactly what makes this mystery so compelling. The evidence keeps pointing in the same general direction, but every clue has an alternative explanation. Then came the test that seemed as if it would finally end the debate. Radiocarbon dating. In 1988, laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona analyzed samples from the shroud. The reported result placed the material in the medieval period. For many people, that was the end of the story. If the cloth dated from the Middle Ages, then it could not have wrapped the body of a first-century man. The shroud was a medieval object. Case closed, except that the debate did not end. Because years later, researchers questioned the location from which the carbon dating sample had been taken. The sample came from an edge section of the shroud, and according to later claims, that area may have been repaired or reinforced at some point in the cloth's history. If that section contained newer material, then the carbon dating could potentially have been measuring the age of the repaired portion rather than the original fabric. This remains one of the most controversial aspects of the entire shroud debate, because now two very different scientific stories appear to exist. One suggested a medieval date. Other research argued that the dating sample might not represent the main body of the cloth. And as scientists continued examining the shroud, another question emerged. What if the most important evidence was not its age at all? What if it was the image itself? Because whatever created the image did something extraordinarily unusual. It did not behave like ordinary paint. The image appears extremely shallow, affecting only the outermost portions of individual linen fibers. There are no obvious brush strokes. No convention el pantidautla. No simple pigment layer that explains everything. Instead, researchers have described chemical changes involving oxidation and dehydration of the fibers. Attempts to reproduce the complete image have produced partial similarities, but no universally accepted explanation has emerged that accounts for every feature. And then there is the three-dimensional information. Some researchers have argued that the intensity of the image contains information related to the distance between the body and the cloth. If true, that would be extremely difficult to reproduce using conventional medieval artistic techniques. But again, the shroud refuses to provide an easy answer. Every discovery seems to solve one mystery while creating another. And now we return to the DNA. Because perhaps the most important lesson is that the genetic material does not appear to be a single secret code written into the shroud. It is something stranger, a collection of biological traces accumulated over time. A microscopic record of contact, a history written not with ink, but with cells. And if the geographic distribution of those traces really reflects the cloth's journey, then the shroud may have carried evidence of an extraordinary path from the ancient Middle East through the crossroads of the Byzantine world and eventually into medieval Europe. But there is still one question that towers above all of them. Who was the man whose image became trapped in the linen? And what happened in the seconds, or less, when that mysterious image was formed? Because if the shroud is authentic, then somewhere between death and burial, something happened that modern science still cannot completely reproduce. And that may be the most astonishing mystery of all. But the DNA did not reveal one simple answer. Instead, it revealed something far stranger. Researchers found multiple mitochondrial lineages on the shroud, including genetic signatures associated with regions of the Middle East, Europe, Africa, and South Asia. The findings were published in scientific reports, but they did not prove that the DNA belonged to Jesus. In fact, the researchers emphasized that the cloth had been exposed to people for centuries, making contamination impossible to ignore. And that may be the real secret. The shroud could be carrying a biological record of everyone who came into contact with it. Pilgrims, clergy, merchants, researchers, ordinary visitors. Each person could have left behind microscopic traces of skin, hair, or other biological material. Over hundreds of years, those traces accumulated inside the fabric. That means the DNA may be telling us less about one man and more about the extraordinary journey of the cloth itself. And the journey may explain why genetic material appears connected to so many different regions. If the shroud really passed through ancient Middle Eastern and Byzantine centers before reaching Europe, then it would have encountered people from across the ancient trade routes. But there is another problem. DNA can tell scientists where a lineage is commonly found, but it cannot always tell them when that DNA arrived on the cloth. A Middle Eastern genetic sequence does not automatically prove first-century origin. A European sequence does not automatically prove medieval manufacture. The shroud's biological evidence is therefore fascinating, but not definitive. The same caution applies to the blood. Researchers have reported biological characteristics consistent with genuine blood and severe trauma, while other interpretations remain disputed. The markings on the cloth appear consistent with scourging and crucifixion, but those injuries were not unique to Jesus. Thousands of people were crucified in the ancient Roman world, so the evidence can potentially tell us what happened to the man. It cannot, by itself, tell us his name. Then there's the biggest obstacle of all, carbon dating. In 1988, laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona dated the tested material to the medieval period. That result became the strongest argument that the shroud was a later creation. Later researchers challenged the result, arguing that the tested corner may have contained repaired material and therefore might not represent the original linen. But that remains part of an ongoing scientific debate. And this is why the shroud refuses to surrender its secret. One test points toward the Middle Ages. Other evidence suggests connections to the ancient Middle East. The DNA reveals centuries of human contact. The pollen provides geographic clues. The blood patterns suggest severe trauma. And the image itself remains extraordinarily difficult to explain completely. Perhaps future technology will finally separate the original biological traces from centuries of contamination. If scientists can isolate the oldest layer of DNA, they may be able to determine whether it came from the region where Jesus lived or from somewhere else entirely. Until then, the so-called secret DNA code does not prove that the shroud belonged to Jesus. But it does reveal something remarkable. This piece of linen has been touched, carried, studied, and preserved across generations, quietly collecting microscopic traces of the people and places that surrounded it. The shroud may not contain a single genetic answer. It may contain a biological history. And somewhere beneath centuries of contamination, that history could still be hiding the oldest clue of all. The question is whether science will ever become precise enough to find it.